Welcome on France24 to this new edition of the Talk of Paris. Our guest this week is the president of one of the largest countries in the world, and certainly the largest country in Latin America, the president of Brazil, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. President Lula, good day, Mr. President.
Hello.
You're in Brussels to sign a strategic partnership agreement between Europe and Brazil. It's the first time a Latin American country is signing such a strategic partnership. You're also here to promote biofuels because you're convinced that to save the planet, we have to try and adopt an alternative to oil, that is to say, biofuels. You'll tell us why. Can we say that, in a way, you're no longer only the president of the poor, but also the president of the environmental movement?
Yesterday, I signed a strategic partnership in Lisbon with the Prime Minister Socrates, the President of the European Commission, Barroso. Yesterday evening, we had dinner attended by Nicolas Sarkozy and Prime Minister Zapatero. This is very important for then our entire Latin American region, indeed. The question is of one then of biofuels, one that is very much on the agenda today and inevitable for the entire world in the 21st century. Our countries and the government need to tackle this issue with a vengeance. Today, with global warming causing major problems and issues for mankind, above all, owing to releases of greenhouse gas effects causing then problems. It is our responsibility today to begin to build up a fairer, more equitable world and a less polluted one. And that's why that biofuels today is one that must be very much on the agenda. To reduce those greenhouse effect gases, we must also build and develop jobs in the world. I believe that this is part of the major decisions that the European Union must take and will be taking. We need to mix 10% of biofuels then in petrol and in diesel fuel. And that is a key and major issue indeed.
So, on this issue, you're on the same wavelength as the Europeans. Nevertheless, some people wonder if these biofuels will cause deforestation, notably in Indonesia, where a lot of biofuels are produced. Isn't there a potential danger for the Amazonian forest?
Certainly not. There's a concern here, a concern around biofuels that may cause problems for us in our Amazon forest. The Portuguese arrived in Brazil in 1500. 470 years ago, they introduced sugarcane to Brazil. The climate in the Amazon region didn't allow that to happen. So Amazonia was preserved. Now, I also note another important key point, which is that Brazil is a country that has 440 million hectares of farmland. Sugarcane accounts for only 1% of that land. Therefore, we have major potential. The African continent and the rest of Latin America. There must be no dispute or challenge here over the production of fuels.
So why do people criticize you? Even President of Latin America, President Morales of Bolivia, accuses you of favoring the rich, of plotting against the poor, of preferring the battle for biofuels instead of feeding the poor and the Indians in particular. What have you got to say in reply?
I believe that Ivo was probably right, given that there probably was that possibility, but the main energy we need today comes from the food we eat. If we don't produce food, we won't have the potential to produce other forms of energy. We need farmland. that needs to be protected. We need to protect our food and, of course, biofuels. Look at Bolivia, Latin America, Brazil and Africa, and you'll realize that there are huge swathes of territory where there are no crops, no fuels, no biofuels. Why? Because today, food in the world is not about a lack of food, but a lack of purchase power so that people can buy food.
Yes, precisely. It's going to increase the prices of agricultural products and maize in particular, which will penalize the poor, won't it?
Who said that increasing petrol prices will not increase food prices? Recently, we were paying $28 for a barrel of petrol. Today, that's $70, and that will obviously increase food prices accordingly. We are convinced that, first of all, we must not produce ethanol from corn. Ethanol produced in Brazil is 76% less expensive than the ethanol produced in the US and 46% less expensive than produced in Europe. We want to produce it from sugarcane and biodiesel fuel. We will be producing that from plants. Then that may be grown in many African and Latin American countries. Now, of course, I know that from a European perspective, when we talk about biofuels, that issue is not on the agenda. With your strong farming, then potential. We must turn to countries where there's a real potential for development.
Well, in any case, it has reduced your dependence on oil because Brazil uses enormous amounts of biofuel, and so you have ethanol. Hugo Chavez has oil. Isn't there any rivalry between both of you?
I believe that the world will need petrol for the foreseeable future at least. We should think about mixing biofuel with fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse effect gases.
Mr. President, true to tradition, let's watch a profile of you by Clovis Casali of France24.
A Kennedy-style parade for a man who grew up in a favela like so many other Brazilians. Lula, as people fondly call him, achieved something few expected. He was re-elected for a second term with a whopping 61% of the votes. In 2002, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva won the presidency, riding a wave of hope for the poor of Brazil. For the first time in history, Brazil and its 190 million inhabitants swung to the left. That night in Sao Paulo, people celebrated a man who has never been to university and speaks no foreign language. Born in 1945, Lula is the seventh child of a family of 8. He himself has 5 children. His wife Marisa Letitia has stood by his side since 1974. At the time, Lula headed a workers' union and organized the first strikes that had taken place in Brazil in 10 years. Police forces violently dispersed demonstrators. In 1980, Lula was imprisoned for 31 days. He then helped found the Workers' Party and went on to get elected to Congress in 1986. President since 2002, polls predicted a landslide victory in the first round of the 2006 election, but corruption scandals involving his entourage undermined his candidacy. Still, he won in the second round. Lula vowed to improve living conditions for the poor, putting social programs at the top of his agenda, especially in health and education. But Brazilian society remains torn by violence, with gang killings and prison upheavals throughout the country. The army is forced to intervene regularly. Lula's pragmatist approach to politics infuriates some of his fellow South American leaders. Lula's agreement with President Bush over ethanol and biofuels sparked an angry response from Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. But Lula stood his ground, just like when he decided to end the monopoly of some pharmaceutical giants by offering generic drugs to Brazilians with HIV. Despite being Catholic, Lula publicly stated his support for abortion, going against the Pope's mandate. Though members of his party strongly back him, some say reforms are taking too long, and people in the favelas still expect more from Lula. But he remains extremely popular, with the support of 64% of Brazilians.
Mr. President, I saw you smile during this profile. Are you interested to see your career reviewed?
Looking at the history of elections, I remember how hard it was to become president of the Brazilian Republic. Indeed, I lost 3 elections. I could have opted out, as others did, after failing. But I decided not to, but to show the Brazilian people that it was important to persevere, to try again and again, and not let failure take over. And it gave me added strength to fight. And in 2002, I won the elections. In 2006, I was re-elected. It was a blessing from God, and I warmly thank the Brazilian people.
On the day you became president for the first time, you made a big speech in which you said that hope had overcome fear, that you were going to reform Brazil, and yet you didn't fulfill all your promises during your first mandate. What's your objective for this second mandate?
Clearly, you can't do in 4 or 8 years what it took 500 years to do, but the facts are there. And we have rescued the Brazilian economy. Today, we have no debts with regard to the IMF, the Paris Club. We have $150 billion in international reserve. We have a trade surplus of $47 billion. And the first 5 months of this year have shown that we have generated 1 million regular jobs. At the same time, we have set up a major income transfer program, family aid, to help the poorest members of our communities. This requires, in turn, that families send their children to school. We have a university program. The government will be supporting the poor in our suburbs so that they can send their children to university. And in 3 years, 370,000 poor people went to university. We are committed in the next 3 years, 3.5 years, to open professional colleges in each town and city, federal universities as well. We are committed to do that through an investment abroad, nationwide education investment program to turn Brazil into a highly developed country.
Mr. President, you have marked the history of the continent. Let's listen to a webcam question by a web surfer who will be asking you on the changes taking place in Latin America.
D'autres présidents en Amérique latine ont été les symboles d'un virage à gauche sur tout le continent. Est-ce que cette évolution est profonde? Et si oui, comment vous l'expliquez? Est-ce que ce phénomène va durer ou il peut y avoir un retournement?
Votre réponse?
Your reply?
That is indeed happening. After 2 decades of prevailing neoliberalism in South America from the year 2000, we are seeing a change in the political profile of the country. Today, we have a continent where there are many progressive presidents, people committed to and with the people. Take Chile under Michel Bachelet, then Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Venezuela, Ecuador are examples of that, where the commitment of Uribe of Colombia and the changes in Peru are examples. So South America today has a more progressive, more leftist profile, and that's a very positive development because this will counter decades of military intervention on our continent and conservative politics. With God's help, South America, it will grow economically and will improve the quality of life of its people.
Let's go back for a moment to President Chavez in Venezuela. He's been hard on you when the Brazilians protested against the closure of a private TV channel. He said the Brazilians were the mouthpieces of Washington. Were you offended? Are you a spokesman for George Bush?
Look, no one will force me to fight with Chavez. He's a friend of mine. He's my friend. He governs a country and he helps the poor people of Venezuela. He has contacts with Brazil, close contacts. Brazil invests heavily in Venezuela. Brazil is building the metro system in Caracas, is building roads, and we have partnerships with Venezuelan oil companies. And we will continue that friendship. Quite clearly, I'm not impressed by that tone adopted by some Latin American presidents. We believe what we say, and we say things sometimes we don't always believe. What is important that we have accomplished changes. We have differences in different sectors. But when someone becomes a head of state, the personal aspects must be phased out, and the collective issues must gain in importance. Our relations with Venezuela are important. I learned that Chavez said one day that if Brazil did not take a decision 3 months from now, it would exit from Mercosur. But Venezuela is not right to do that. It may decide to come in or not, to enter Mercosur or not, but it must comply with its rules and procedures, just as Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina and Brazil do. And then we must wait until the Brazilian Congress votes on that. Our TV viewers should know that Parliament then felt offended by Chavez, but defended Chavez then during the coup in Venezuela. That is a contradiction, a political contradiction, and we must learn to live with those contradictions. Otherwise, there's not much point.
Mr. President, that's the end of the first part of our program. Let's listen to the latest news on France24. Join us in a few moments for the second part of the Talk of Paris. Welcome back to the set of the Talk of Paris on France24 with President Lula of Brazil. As we're in Brussels, in Europe, Mr. President, is Europe too protectionist? At the moment, the trade negotiations, the Doha cycle trade negotiations, aren't going very well, and I think you criticize the Europeans, and the French in particular, for keeping agricultural tariffs too high. In your view, is France too protectionist, notably as regards agricultural products?
I believe that each country becomes conservative when it defends its own interests. Look what's happening within the Doha cycle. On the one hand, we're asking the Americans to reduce their internal farm subsidies from $17 billion to $12 billion. Point one. Point two, we're also asking the European Union to open its agricultural markets to the developing countries, and that the United States and the European Union require the G20 to open up to industrial products. Where exactly does this divergence lie? Well, it's really based on figures. We've not yet struck an agreement, and quite clearly, France is protecting its agriculture, and the European Union is doing so, as is Brazil, who wants to defend its industrial interests.
Say to the Europeans and the Americans to break the deadlock and to have a signature of a trade agreement by the end of this year?
I've told the Americans and the Europeans this. We must strike an agreement that doesn't benefit the United States nor the European Union. This is not an agreement that favors the developing countries such as China, India or Brazil, but it's an agreement that can really help the world's poorest countries. How can we, in the 21st century, continue with incredibly high levels of consumption in the developed world while millions and millions of people are starving in the developing countries, in our poorest countries? What we're asking is for more solidarity, humanitarian aid within the Doha cycle, so that we can help poor people to survive.
People criticize Brazil for not sufficiently lowering its tariffs in order to prevent China or India from exporting their products to Brazil. Are you going to make an effort too?
What we want, we've no problem here between the G20 countries. We're on very good terms with exporters in Europe and the US. What we want is greater flexibility, opening up farming markets from Europe and outside. Quite clearly, at the moment, what we need is then more interchange. The Americans today, in the last 4 years, spent $4 billion, $12 billion on its own internal farm industry. We also ask subsidies to the tune of $12 billion. They asked for $17 billion. They want to increase then above and beyond the average in the last 4 years, and that's not possible. The poor countries, the developing countries, need to tap into more opportunities, growth opportunities. However, I'm an optimist, and I believe in negotiations.
Let's go back to the Latin American common market, the Mercosur. Given Venezuela's position, isn't there a risk of this common market imploding?
Let me make a point here. When the French people rejected the referendum, in its referendum, the European Constitution, there was no crisis in France, was there? The French people opposed that draft constitution. But in Latin America, people say that there is a crisis whenever there's a problem, but there is no crisis. Mercosur has been around for 15 years with Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina and Brazil's involvement. We have problems, just as the European Union does, and those problems will be solved with time. We want to bring all South American countries into the Mercosur organization, but that won't happen overnight, of course. This will require a political maturing of governments. National states must also play their part. We will continue to experience differences of opinion between us, but that should not be an undue cause for concern. We are fully aware that there will be no individual outcome for any one Latin American country or South American country alone. One country, however, cannot go it alone. However, Brazil will need to work with other countries. We must work within the Mercosur, given our differences, putting those differences on the table to make South America a continent that grows and expands, creating jobs and wealth and income. Otherwise, we will be as poor in the 20th as in the 21st century.
Let's listen to a webcam question on the poorest of the poor in Brazil, those who live in the favelas or shanty towns. You've just announced a program for the development of the shanty towns. Let's listen to this webcam question, thanks to Daily Motion.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai lu que vous aviez annoncé que vous alliez débloquer une forte somme d'argent pour aider les favelas. J'aurais aimé savoir comment vous comptiez vous assurer que cet argent aille bien aux personnes qui en ont vraiment besoin.
Votre réponse?
Thank you for that question. We're currently rolling out the greatest urbanization of our favelas program in our history. 40 billion reals have been earmarked, of which $20 billion are now being invested. We are teaming up with governments, state governments, municipal governments. We've signed an MOU with the state of Rio and Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais. We're signing other agreements, and we are committed now between our federal governments, regional authorities, federal governments are working with them to begin those projects now. The Brazilian state needs to offer more community services to its poorest members. Otherwise, organized crime will spread. We must urbanize our shanty towns, build streets, open schools and health centers, involving our citizens more through more solidarity. This is what we want to do up to 2010.
In the meantime, there are still outbreaks of violence. Recently in Rio, the police intervened very brutally. The Pan American Games will be held very soon in Brazil. Is Brazil under threat because of violence?
I wouldn't take that news personally at face value. Especially when young people in France riot, set fire to cars, we must step back and not take that at face value either. We have problems, violence, as in all countries. But we must work closely with state governments, first of all, to offer opportunities to those who most need them outside of violence. We must stamp down hard on those who perpetuate violence. We must deal with our issues in the favelas, health, arts, education, culture, so that young Brazilian people can have real hope for the future.
And do you expect the Pan American Games to go smoothly?
Look, here we have one of the most widespread security systems in Brazil for the Pan American Games. 11,000 young people are part of a citizenship campaign who will be helping athletes, journalists during those games. We will then be using those young people, working with them in a very sophisticated way. They will be helping us. Then, for the entire country, we will be drawing on those Pan American Games to test a new security system that will be more sophisticated, with helicopters, intelligence services, and a well-trained police force. After the Games, we will be taking stock of that situation. That security system will remain in place, and we will draw on that experience in other Brazilian states.
Let's listen to another webcam question. This time it's on corruption and the recent scandals that have left their mark on Brazil.
Bonjour, j'ai lu récemment qu'avait éclaté un scandale qui impliquait un certain nombre de personnalités politiques au niveau fédéral et entre autres le président du Sénat brésilien qui est membre d'un parti qui est allié avec le Parti des Travailleurs, avec votre parti. Donc j'aurais aimé savoir ce que vous pensiez de cette affaire et plus largement si vous pensez qu'il était possible d'en finir avec l'impunité des élites brésiliennes qui dure déjà depuis des siècles.
Une question de fond, parce que la corruption,
So this is a substantial question. There's corruption everywhere, but there's a lot of corruption in Brazil. It even almost jeopardized your recent re-election.
You've already answered the question. Tell me a country where there is no corruption. Now, throughout the history of Brazil, the Brazilian state has fought corruption, which is what we're doing now. In the Brazilian print media, what we're seeing are stories on how government is efficient or sometimes is not efficient in protecting its people from corruption, the federal police, and the state prosecutors. Their work, too, is important. So, who decides who should be arrested or not? Who is guilty or not? The president must not take that decision, but the judiciary should. The judiciary guarantees our democratic system in Brazil as in other countries. The print media must not press charges as such. What we want now is that all people, human beings, be deemed innocent until otherwise proved guilty. where charges are brought, investigations will be conducted, and where proof is given and delivered, the judiciary will then decide on whether or not a sentence will be issued or not. We have many prisoners in Brazil.
All the same, aren't you saddened by the fact that this is a cloud on your first term of office and that it could jeopardize your re-election? How have you reacted personally? What's your state of mind?
Of course I was saddened by that. Who wouldn't have been? However, I'm fully aware, and the Brazilians know, that my heritage and legacy comes from my mother. What she taught me was to stand high, to hold my head high, to walk high, to be honest and upright. Those are the qualities, and that is my obligation. That is what my mother taught me, and the Brazilians know that. My staunchest opponents know that too. They can accuse anyone in Brazil, my neighbors, but they cannot accuse me for being corrupt because I'm honest. However, as regards investigating corruption, that is something. There are no friends, no opponents. We are all born honest, and those who are not must pay the price.
Another reform is that of the United Nations, the Security Council. Brazil isn't a member, nor is Japan or Germany. You're a gigantic country. Do you want Brazil to be a member of the Security Council of the United Nations?
We will gain and secure that place. It's a matter of time. Quite clearly, those who sit on the Security Council don't want change. France and the UK want change. They're supporting Brazil. We have a problem today. Italy doesn't want Germany in. China doesn't want Japan in. So the United Nations needs to be radically revamped, because this year, 2007, is not the same world as it was in 1945. This is a different world, a less polarized world, a world without the Cold War. Other countries are gaining in importance in the world today. They must be represented within the United Nations Security Council. We are asking that for Brazil, for the African continent, for Germany, for India, and for other countries.
One last question, Mr. President. Are you happy to be President of Brazil? We know your background. You were a metallurgist and then a trade unionist. Are you happy to be in power today?
I'm happy because my term of office will end in 2010. I will be judged on my achievements. I'll return home, close to my trade union, from where I entered into politics. I'll be able to go back to my factory to talk to my former work colleagues. I've kept those contacts up. I will enter the history of Brazil as a president that has been the most dynamic in terms of social policy, who has built the largest number of technical colleges and universities. A president, I will be remembered as a president that has benefited the small farmers in our country. I believe that I will be able to sleep with a tranquil conscience.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll be following all of this very carefully from Brussels and Paris. I'd like to thank Julia Torner and the France24 team and the European Parliament team. Thank you, Mr. President, and join us again soon on France24.